I don't know how many of you come from Wigan or have lived in Wigan, but hopefully those that have done, this will bring back some memories. I'm sure the ones who lived in Wigan will remember most of the cinemas, but there are probably a few that you've probably never heard of because they closed before you were born. Right. During the early part of the 20th century, going to the cinema was the favourite form of entertainment for the whole nation, and Wigan had a good selection of cinemas to choose from close to the town centre. It allowed the average person to forget his everyday life and problems and gaze on another make-believe world. The paradox of the golden age of the cinema was that it coincided with some of the bleakest years of the 20th century. A family night out at the cinema was not a treat, but a way of life. But then along came that one-eyed monster, television, and that started the slow decline of cinema going. The legendary Hollywood producer Sam Goldwyn admitted as much when he said, "Why should people go out and pay good money to watch bad films when they can stay at home and see bad television for nothing?" As with other large towns in the country, Wigan's cinema history can be traced back to the many theatres and music halls that once flourished here. The first example of a moving picture in Wigan was at the Theatre Royal in King Street, when in 1841 the dioramic panorama was demonstrated. That's the Theatre Royal as it was on King Street, long gone. It was a French invention and consisted of a large screen on rollers that moved across the stage to give the effect of movement. Probably some of you may remember that's where the building was, and that became the Shakespeare Hotel. Long gone. Many of the theatres and cinemas were located on King Street. And that was one of them, the Royal Court Theatre in 1902. It looks like some sort of celebration, possibly for the coronation of Edward VII. Building of the then Royal Court Theatre was completed in 1886. It was designed by the architect Richard T. Johnson, and the contractor was John Johnson Limited, who also built the new hippodrome, the Pavilion and the King's Electric Cinema. The polished marble and granite vestibule and central staircase have changed little over the years, but the auditorium itself was completely changed when the theatre was converted to a cinema. The auditorium, as originally built, had 3 horse-shaped balconies, and the ornate plaster ceiling was surmounted by a 30-foot dome. The cost of this magnificent theatre was estimated at the time at £18,000, and there was seating for 3,500 people. It opened to the public in November 1886 with a performance of The Beggar's Student by the Captain Bainbridge Opera Company. As with most large halls in Wigan, the theatre was often used to show animated pictures, but it was only with the advent of talkies that these showings became more frequent, but then only on Sundays and in aid of charity. In 1930, the theatre was closed, and intensive work began to prepare the premises for the new talking pictures. The name was changed to the Court Cinema, and the next phase of the building's history began on Monday, December the 29th, 1930, with the sound film Common Clay starring Constance Bennett. In 1937, a new Western electric sound system was installed. It was reported by the Wigan Observer that singing voices are particularly clear and beautiful, and all music is reproduced with wonderful fidelity. The court was a cinema with a console organ, the one there being a Crompton installed at the time of the 1930 conversion. In the 1950s, the cinema was a groundbreaker by introducing cinemascope and stereophonic sound to the Wigan audience. That's a picture of it in about the 1960s. By the 1970s, the end was in sight, and news of the court's closure was released in September 1973. The reason for the decision was lack of support, and it was a sad occasion when the doors closed on Saturday, September the 16th, after the screening of The Sound of Music. The building was used as a bingo hall for some time, and more recently has been a nightclub called The Hub. To date, there are still some of the seats left in the long-forgotten auditorium, and in 1988 the building was classified as a listed building of local historical interest. The exterior retains much of the features from its days as a theatre, though in need of TLC, but there is no visual record of the original interior. That's a picture sort of fairly recently, and these are pictures of the auditorium which are still there. That's the original projection room. In 2018, the building was bought by the organisation that runs the Old Courts complex at the back of the Wigan Parish Church. And at the moment, it is being refurbished to be used in the future as a theatre venue. That is something to look forward to. That was literally last week. Next one, I'm going to talk about the Hippodrome, which was mainly a theatre, but it did show films. How many here actually went to the Hippodrome? Anybody? Yeah, Ron. I think I only went once, and that must have been about literally a few weeks before it went up in flames. It was built by the local entertainment mogul John Wersick to seat 2,500 people. The Grand Theatre and Hippodrome was launched as a gala matinee on Wednesday the 7th of March 1904. Otto Schumann's circus topped the bill, and the programme concluded with an exhibition of animated photographs. Although it was successful, it was practically rebuilt 5 years later to open as the new Hippodrome. Almost everyone of note in the history of British variety theatre played at the Hippodrome, including George Formby Sr., George Robey, Harry Lauder, Harry Houdini and Gracie Fields. The stars were still coming in the 1950s with Joseph Locke, Jimmy James, Donald Pierce and Morecambe and Wise. Before he found fame in Hollywood, Charlie Chaplin appeared there with the Fred Karner comedy troupe, and an unknown teenager from Tiger Bay called Shirley Bassey sang in an all-black revue called Harlem Nights. Julie Andrews appeared at the Hippodrome on December the 15th, 1947, with her stepfather Ted Andrews and mother Barbara. She wasn't listed in the programme, but was used as a gag as part of the act. The selection of animated photographs remained a regular feature for years, designed to hurry the audience out of the building so staff could prepare for the second house. These picture shows continued until the early war years, and in 1912 replaced the variety shows for a period when the Pavilion in Library Street was being renovated. The Hippodrome received a major facelift in 1935, when the original upper gallery was removed and the seating capacity reduced to 1,200. Variety acts remained the principal entertainment during the life of the Hippodrome, but the arrival of television and the social changes of the 1950s affected theatre and cinema audiences. While the film industry could counter with wider screens, bigger films, variety could add little to its particular brand of entertainment. Places like the Hippodrome tried to attract customers with seedy girl reviews with titles such as Hotter Than Paris and We Never Clothed. I'm sure some of you went to these things. After the last of these performances on Friday 21st, 1956, a disastrous fire broke out, probably caused by a discarded cigarette. Wasn't me. I was only about 6 at the time. By the time the alarm was raised, the blazing upper circle had collapsed into the dress circle, and debris from there set the stalls on fire. There were plans to rebuild the theatre, and Mecca Dance Halls was reported to be purchasing the site for a dance hall, but nothing came of it. The remains of the building were demolished. The site was sold to a supermarket chain, Lennon's, and the existing building demolished to be replaced by a new purpose-built building, which became the first supermarket in Wigan. So that's the site of the Hippodrome. Anybody remember Lennon's? For many years after, the chimney over the dressing room block remained with the logo HIP emblazoned on it, but even now this has been removed. And that's the site now, just a car park. Now, I don't know how many of you remember this one at the bottom of King Street, the Palace Cinema. The Palace Cinema occupied an empty warehouse on the corner of King Street and Chapel Lane, once owned by Robinson's Wigan Brewery. The building was used for boxing and wrestling matches as well as a roller rink, before being converted in 1911 to a cinema. In the late 1920s, the building was completely refurbished and modernised with the addition of a balcony. The new Luke Palace was equipped with a British talking picture sound system in 1931. A new British acoustic system was installed in 1950, and in 1956 the CinemaScope screen was unveiled. Sadly, the unfashionable palace was hit hard by falling audiences and had to close, and the last film was shown on Saturday, February the 19th, 1961. The whole site between Chapel Lane and the former site of the Hippodrome was levelled to make room for Brockle House, headquarters of Wigan's Social Security Department. So that's where the palace was. Now, this is one probably you've never heard of because it was finished before any of us were born. It was called the New Central Hall, and it was on, if you're looking at that, on the left-hand side, further back, is the Town Hall, and on the left is where it says Wigan Examiner. That's where this particular cinema was located. Obviously, those are long gone. The new Central Hall was located in the Public Hall buildings on King Street, now the site of Rodney House, on the corner of King Street and Rodney Street. It was the first place in Wigan to be used exclusively for film shows. In March 1909, the cinema had a screening of the World Heavyweight Boxing Championship between Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns, which had taken place appropriately on Boxing Day in 1908. For a while it was known as Wigan's Bijou Palace Deluxe, but it was only short-lived, and with competition from other new venues in Wigan like the Pavilion and Palace, it closed down in 1914. So this is if you look now at Rodney House, it's a very sort of, well, I'd say modern, but not particularly attractive building. And then the cinema was sort of in there. That's the hippodrome on the other side. And beyond the hippodrome is what used to be the theatre I first talked about. Yeah, that's the corner. That's what a wonderful building, isn't it? Right, the next one to talk about, again in King Street, is the County Playhouse. Construction began in 1916, but work was delayed due to shortage of manpower and materials during the war, and was only completed in 1919. It belonged to the Ghidlow Picturedrome chain and opened in December 1919 with a silent film, The Peril Within, starring Dorothy Gish. The first talkie was the Broadway Melody in 1929. Another early film shown there was Atlantic, the first length feature film based on the sinking of the Titanic. The big attraction at the cinema was the mighty Christie organ that was used for the first time in December 1930. It combined the musical features of the finest cathedral pipe organ and had a full range of effects, including drums, chimes, castanets, boat and train whistles, and even sleigh bells. Many distinguished organists gave recitals on the organ. Customer comfort was always a priority, especially for the disabled, and in 1938 earphones were offered in order that the hard of hearing could hear the film. Experimental films in 3D were also shown in 1938. A major fire in 1949 almost destroyed the cinema, but a complete refurbishment was carried out in record time. There were further alterations in 1954 to prepare for the widescreen era. But the county closed after the last performance of The Sword in the Stone on Sunday, November the 13th, 1966. And conversion began almost at once to the Star Bingo and Social Club that opened 11 days later, November the 24th. That's the county now. The brother of a friend of mine was the projectionist at the county right up to the end, so we used to get in free sometimes. Other cinemas were close to the centre. The Empire. Anybody remember the Empire? The original site of the Empire in Cooper's Row was occupied by the Hole in the Wall Inn. This was replaced by the Alexandra Music Hall in 1874. And this introduced a bioscope as in addition to the live acts. It changed its name to the Empire Palace of Varieties in 1892. The interior was remodelled in 1906, by which time animated film shows were the main feature. In 1919 it was closed for 6 months to allow further modernisation and extended to accommodate 1,400 people. Musical accompaniment to the silent films was provided by Madame Holroyd and the New Empire Orchestra. The Empire was one of the first Wigan cinemas to be converted to talkies, and on August 1929 The Singing Fool with Al Jolson was screened. The first widescreen pictures at the Empire were seen in October 1955 when it was announced that the new wide illuminated screen and high-definition anamorphic lens will be used for projection to give a bigger, brighter and clearer picture. The screen was christened with Gary Cooper and Burt Lancaster in Vera Cruz. However, times were changing, and the cinema closed on September the 27th, 1961, with its final film, So Evil, So Young, starring Jill Ireland and John Charlesworth. The building was turned into an Empire Bingo Hall in 1962, and despite emotional appeals from the local civic trust, was compulsory purchased by Wigan Metro and demolished as part of the town centre development plan. So that was it being demolished in the late 1970s. And that's the site today. I mean, you wonder why demolish it when they've not done anything with it. You know, I mean, that's the John Bull pub on the left-hand side. So just basically, it's just an open site. Anybody remember the Pavilion? Yeah. Right. I remember the Pavilion on Library Street at the bottom. That's where the baths, the new baths, were built. It was quite a glamorous building from the outside. The Pavilion was the first venture by the Wigan Entertainment Co. Limited. The huge, almost square hall was built to stage a wide variety of activities and amusements, exhibitions, circuses, orchestral concerts, dances, etc. But its prime function was a roller skating rink, and for the staging of roller hockey matches. It opened in March 1909 with a charity concert in aid of the Wigan Children's Clog and Stacking Fund. In October 1909, it was used for a one-off cinematographic show, and this was such a success that animated pictures became the principal attraction at the Pavilion. A full programme of pictures began in December with daily shows, including Sundays. Sunday shows continued until 1913, when they were curtailed due to other cinemas who had been refused Sunday licences objecting. In 1917, a new Jardine organ was installed, and an opening recital was given by the composer David Clegg, who was the organist at Blackpool's Winter Gardens. This organ was replaced by a later model in 1929, and in the summer of 1939 the building was closed for refurbishment when a suspended ceiling and new seating was installed. By then the organ was rarely used, and it was removed to the Queen's Hall in Market Street, where it was destroyed by fire in 1949. The 2,000 capacity at the Pavilion was rarely tested, except on Saturday nights, when the cinema gained a reputation for rowdiness in the infamous Monkey Rack, a long balcony on three sides of the building. The lease on the building was due to expire in 1959, and the council had plans for the site, though so the cinema was allowed to run down. Unlike other cinemas, the Pavilion did not install a wide screen, and the end came on Boxing Day 1958 with the final screening of The Cruel Tower starring Charles McGraw. The site was cleared to make way for Wigan's so-called Olympic International Pool, and this also made way for the present Civic Building. So that's the site now. The Princess. Anybody been in the Princess? Yeah. Oh, two. It was probably the least glamorous of the cinemas. Originally known as the King's Electric Theatre, it was the first purpose-built cinema in the town centre and opened on May the 1st, 1911. Live entertainment was included in the programme, with the resident King's London Orchestra providing music for the artistes and pictures. The King's closed in 1922, and under new ownership, the Prince's Cinema Limited opened in 1923 with the film Little Lord Fauntleroy, starring Mary Pickford. It was renamed the New Princess in March of that year. Live entertainment, or refined vaudeville, as the management preferred to call it, continued for several years. The Princess had the distinction of showing the first talking picture in Wigan when new sound equipment was installed for the presentation of Showboat in August 1929. It changed hands again in 1933, and the original building was demolished and an adjacent plot acquired for the construction of a new cinema. It was impossible to appreciate. It was impossible to appreciate the architectural lines of the new building because of its location in the narrow passage at the side of the then Clarence Hotel. Nevertheless, the entrance was imposingly lit by floodlighting. The Princess changed hands twice again, and under new management of Buxton Theatres it gained reputation for expert publicity. Talent contests and live acts returned and promotional competitions were popular. And Molly Crompton from Ashton won a handbag for an essay on the film Pygmalion. Anybody know Molly Crompton?
Still got that handbag.
When the British Board of Film Classification introduced the X certificate, the Princess made a habit of booking controversial films. The policy of booking avant-garde movies worked well for the Princess. It seemed the only place in town where audiences were attracted to them. Only the Ritz in the town centre outlived the Princess, and it closed January 1970 with the final performance of The Mad Room starring Shelley Winters. The building has been used on and off since as a nightclub and discotheque. The Ritz, which I'm sure a lot of you will have fond memories of. That's an architectural design of it. That's a picture from 1972. I'm sure that brings back fond memories. For exactly 60 years, the Ritz was Wigan's greatest centre of entertainment, being the town's largest, most prestigious and best appointed cinema. It was a tragedy when it was demolished to make way for the Grand Arcade. It was opened in 1938, and there was concern among other cinema owners when plans for the 2,500-seater luxury cinema were announced. Nevertheless, the cinema opened for business March the 9th, 1938. As well as being a cinema, the building had a large stage area, and during the war there were many concerts with the popular big bands of the era, including the Squadronaires, Joe Loss and Jack Payne. Other attractions were the Ralph Reeder Gang Show and the Polish Air Force Choir. Local superstar George Formby played there in a charity performance in April 1940. The Ritz was the first cinema in Wigan to have continuous shows starting in the afternoon, and the double feature was another innovation. The ABC Miners was also very popular on Saturdays. It was well organised and attracted children from far and wide. When the shadow of recession in the cinema was prominent in the late 50s, the Ritz met the challenge by organising pop concerts. The young Cliff Richards made an appearance as a supporting act to the American duo the Kalin Twins, and he would later return as headline act in the 60s. Buddy Holly also appeared there, stopping at the town's Grand Hotel overnight. Other well-known acts to appear in the 60s included Roy Orbison, The Shadows, the Rolling Stones, and most famously the Beatles. Tom Jones also appeared at the start of his career, after PJ Proby was cancelled due to splitting his trousers on stage. I had tickets for that. And when he was cancelled, I went and got my tickets back, and she said, "We've a very good show on." He said, "It's Tom Jones, I believe he's very good." I said, "No, thanks." In the early 60s, to promote its corporate identity, the ABC circuit dropped the name Ritz and it became plain ABC. The restaurant on the first floor was converted to the Court School of Dancing. Cinema audiences in the 1960s continued to fall, and in '65 they brought in a new manager, Derek Fuller, a man who had a reputation for changing the fortunes of ailing cinemas on the circuit. Originally from Stoke-on-Trent, this was the 7th time he'd uprooted his family because of his work. After 5 successful years at the cinema, he left the ABC to take up the position of promotions manager at Wigan Athletic. Still, anybody remember Derek Fuller? Still lives in Wigan, and he attends my local church where I go, but due to failing health, he's unfortunately in a home. I remember many of his promotions at the Ritz, and he was often in the local papers. There he is. He's advertising a James Bond film and putting, would you believe, a Ford Escort, you know, the sort that James Bond always drove, onto the roof. Yeah, that's Derek Fuller on the top there. But I'm sure they could have got something a bit more glamorous. One of his successors at the Ritz was John Mackintosh, who tried every trick in the book to win audiences back, but it was to no avail. And it was announced in 1977 that it would close after the last showing of When the North Wind Blows. EMI, the organisation that had taken over the ABC chain, immediately started to convert the building into a triplex, 3 small cinemas and a bingo hall. The cinemas opened in October 17th with the following programme. Cinema 1, The Spy Who Loved Me, Roger Moore. Cinema 2, A Star Is Born, Barbara Streisand. Cinema 3, Orca Killer Whale, Richard Harris. The downward spiral of attendances continued, and in 1982 EMI closed the 3 cinemas. The lease was taken over by Peter Hanavi, a man with many years of experience in the industry. But although audiences did increase, the business was running at a loss. The opening of the Robin Park Virgin Multiplex in 1996 was very nearly the last straw. And in 1997, Mr. Hanavi announced that the cinema would close. At the last minute, there was a reprieve, as a Mr. Rajan Patel, who owned a cinema in Croydon, heard of the impending closure and came up with the idea of taking over the lease and to include Asian films in the programme. Although there's no Asian community in Wigan, he hoped to attract large numbers from Preston and Bolton. Sadly, this experiment failed, and the final straw came with the opening of another multiplex at Horwich. Mr. Patel withdrew his support, and Mr. Hanavi had no alternative but to close the Ritz once and for all, Saturday, May the 31st, 1998. These are some of it. That's the auditorium. I think it was a magnificent theatre. For those who haven't been in it, it was a magnificent theatre. That was the entrance hall. That was the outside. And sadly, it was being demolished. Right, obviously there was a lot more cinemas in the area around Wigan. And one of them was the Alliance Picture House, Crompton Street. The Alliance Hall was built in 1893 as a Salvation Army citadel, taking its name from the adjacent Alliance Street. It opened as a cinema in February 1909 under the name of the Canada Picture House. The Wigan Observer reported its opening with enthusiasm, and one of the earliest offerings was a powerful story told under the title, wait for this, Pensions for working men. Now, I'm sure you'd be all queuing up with tickets for that one, wouldn't you? Which was followed with keen interest by the audience. In 1936, a new acoustic sound system was installed for the latest innovation of talking films, and the bench seating was replaced with 750 tip-up seats. It changed its name to the Alliance Picture House, but was still known as the Canada by the locals until it closed in 1945. The building was empty for a number of years until it was acquired by a group of amateur stage enthusiasts, and extensive internal alterations opened as Wigan Little Theatre in March 1948. Now, we're going a bit more obscure now, so maybe some of you might not know these at all. There was one on Walgate. This cinema was located next to the Grapes Hotel on the corner of Clayton Street and Walgate. It's where there's a car showroom now. The Royal had a number of titles over its 30 years history. Originally called simply the Walgate, it was also known as Sansom's Cinema, but more commonly among its regular customers it was known as the Scratch. There's quite a few more of that sort of ilk. As the Walgate, it opened in 1912 and could accommodate 420 people with one show a night, with a children's matinee on Saturday. In 1934, it was extended with new seating and a BTH sound system. In the last 10 years before it closed in 1946, it had a succession of lease owners. By the end of the war, attendances had dropped due to the competition from the larger cinemas in town, and it was converted into a clothing factory and then demolished as part of the redevelopment of the 1980s. So that's the Grapes Hotel on the corner, and the building with the little triangle, that's where the cinema was. I mean, all that's completely gone now. Anybody know this one? The Ghidlow? Yeah. In 1911, a proposal to convert the former chapel on Ghidlow Lane was made by a Mr. Jacob Garner of Kenyon Road, Wigan. Oops, wait a minute. No, I seem to have lost the photograph somewhere. A licence was granted and the cinema opened in December of that year. At the start it was known as the Chapel, but later on it became simply the Ghidlow Picture House. In 1931 it was given a B&H sound system and was adapted for CinemaScope in 1955 for the screening of Green Fire with Stuart Granger and Grace Kelly. The last film to be shown before it closed on October the 10th, 1959, was Love is a Many Splendid Thing with William Holden and Jennifer Jones. This was my local cinema because literally it was the end of where I lived. It had 4 different programmes every week. They had one on Monday, Tuesday, they had one on Wednesday, Thursday, one on Friday, Saturday and one on Sunday. So you could go 4 times, plus children's matinee on a Saturday. The building was converted to a furniture warehouse, and that's what it's like today. Apart from the aforementioned cinemas, there were many other local cinemas in the surrounding area. In Scholes, there was the new Labour Hall Picturedrome, situated on the first floor above the Scholes Labour Club. That's a rather neglected Scholes Labour Club. During the general strike of 1926, Children were allowed in free if they brought an empty jam jar. It closed in 1953. Nearby, the Scholes Picture House, originally known as the Star, was built around 1914. It lasted until 1959, and after standing empty for 5 years, opened as a beat club to try and rival the Cavern in Liverpool. Not much chance. It was short-lived and was demolished as part of the Scholes redevelopment in the late 1960s. Higher Ince had a picture palace on Humphrey Street, right in the middle of Ince. Unfortunately, I've not got a picture of that one. It opened in 1911 and changed its name to the Doric under new ownership in 1935. It was advertised as the little cinema with big attractions, but was better known as the Bug, for reasons we can well imagine. The Doric closed in 1957 with the screening of Attack starring Jack Palance. Lower Ince also had a cinema, the Regal, on Manley Street. This opened in 1938 and lasted until 1959. The building's still there and now is a small manufacturing unit. Hindley also had a number of cinemas. The Victoria Hall in Market Street, later known as the Castle, opened in 1911 and closed in June 1957. The building became the Conservative Club and is now known as the Madison Hall, containing function rooms. The Palace, also on Market Street, opened in 1911, was the last to close in 1963, to be converted to a bingo hall. The building is still there today, although it houses shop units. The last to be built in Hindley was the Rex on Atherton Road, adjacent to Hindley Parish Church. This was the first of Hindley's cinemas to close in February 1957. It was leased to the council and converted to the popular Monaco Ballroom, and it's now known as the Rose Club. Orrell had a cinema, you might be surprised to know, and that's it being built in the 1930s. It was called the Majestic, and it was on Sefton Road, but it closed in 1966. For many years it was used as a manufacturing unit for Majestic windows until they went into liquidation. It was demolished in 2000 and it's now a housing site. Pemberton had 3 cinemas. The Central Hall, Lamberhead Green, was originally built as a roller rink, but after being converted to a cinema in 1911, had a short career and closed during the First World War. In 1913, a newly built cinema opened on Obscott Road near the Halfway House. It was originally called the Royal Electric Cinema. It changed its name to the Halfway House Picture Palace and then finally to the Carlton, but due to falling audience, closed in the late 50s. It was then converted into the Carlton Cabaret Club that later became the Sportsman's Club. Anybody remember the Sportsman's Club? I'll give you some money after, Ron. I'm glad some... When its popularity declined in the early 70s, it stood empty for a number of years before being converted to 3 small cinema units and renamed Unit 4, which I thought was rather strange. As it had 3 units, it was called Unit 4, but there you go. This was a popular format, but the opening of the new multiplex sounded its end and it closed in May 1997. And the building is now a carpet warehouse. The third of Pemberton's cinemas were the Queen's, built in 1916 and refurbished in 1937. It was equipped for CinemaScope, but in 1955 was but it was closed in 1964. It remained empty for many years before being converted to a squash club in 1979. The building has since been demolished and replaced with flats. So that's how it was as shop units. Platt Bridge, unbelievably, had 2 cinemas. The Miners' Hall on the corner of Lily Lane and Warrington Road, which is on the lights right in the middle of Platt Bridge, was originally built as a recreation centre for the Lancashire and Cheshire Miners Federation, but was licensed to show films in 1911. Following a disastrous fire in 1952, it was refurbished as a cinema with a new name, the Savoy. CinemaScope was installed in 1955, but due to falling audiences it closed in 1957, and in 1964 the building was demolished. That's the Palace Cinema. It was built near the King Billy pub on Liverpool Road and opened again in 1912. Again, the introduction of CinemaScope did not save it, and it closed in 1959. Standish also had a couple of cinemas. Sammy Grant's, or the Penny Itch, on Market Street, that closed in 1927, and it was converted into a gymnasium. And the Palace on the corner of Cross Street and Standish High Street that opened in 1927. Although it had a new sound system and wide screen fitted in 1954, it was not successful and closed in 1957 with its final film, Reach for the Sky, starring Kenneth More. Upholland was still within Wigan's boundaries when the Lyric Cinema closed in 1957. It was a white elephant for many years before a cleaning supplies company took it over in 1976. And that's as it is now. Last but not least, Ashton also had its fair share of cinemas. The Cooperative Hall in Gerrard Street opened in 1909 and was the first to hold a licence, but it only lasted until 1919. Another building to hold a licence to show films was the theatre known as the Hippodrome on Heaths Road, and this was then rebuilt as a cinema. During the 1930s it changed its name to the Scala, and a new sound system was installed. It closed in the early 1960s and for some time was used as a printworks. That's now been demolished and it's been replaced by flats. So that's the building as a printworks, and those are the flats that are on the site. Another purpose-built cinema was the Palace on Bryn Street, originally known as the Royal Picture Palace. The ABC chain took it over in 1933, at which time its capacity was 483. It closed in 1966 following ABC's policy of only retaining cinemas that could accommodate 1,000 or more. That's the Palace in the 1962s. And that's it now as a shopping arcade. The largest of Ashton cinemas was the Queen's on Wigan Road that opened in the 1920s with a capacity of 868 seats. It survived into the 1960s when it was converted into a bingo hall. Currently it is a well-known nightclub. At the moment, the only surviving cinema in the Wigan area is the Empire Multiplex on Robin Park. This opened in 1996 as the Virgin Multiplex by Richard Branson and sounded the death knell for the two remaining cinemas in Wigan. The Unit 4 triplex in Pemberton and the Ritz in Wigan, the end of an era. It remains to be seen if it will survive the modern digital age with the younger generation watching films on their phones and iPads. Apart from the latest blockbusters, the audience are not very high. In my opinion, there's no comparison with watching a film on the big screen. I remember attending a showing of Titanic when it first came out on the giant screen at Robin Park and was awestruck. Maybe in the future, the coming generations will look back with nostalgia at what they have missed. With the proposed town centre development by the council due to start this year, including a cinema, bowling alley and other leisure outlets, it remains to be seen whether or not Wigan will be able to support 2 cinemas. I'm very much doubtful. Thank you.